Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ProgCast. I am your host, Gregg Bendian, and as always, we'll be getting into different corners, nooks and crannies of the music universe and all the tangents it touches upon. Today, of course, is no exception, and I have a very interesting guest that I'm going to speak with who has made it his life's work to be involved with both music and comic books. And so he is a man after my own heart, and I'm very happy to have him here. He worked at Marvel in the difficult period of the 1990s, where he made a lot of significant, cool things happen. And then he went on to be the president and CEO of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for over a decade. So we've got a lot of stuff we can talk about today. Very happy to welcome Terry Stewart. Hi, Terry.
Hey, Greg. Thanks for having me. It's a real thrill to be able to talk about all this stuff with somebody who relates to it. It doesn't always happen on both fronts. And you and I have made pretty much a lifetime of our interest in this direction. So I look forward to going through as much as we can.
That's great. I always wonder how this kind of crazy stuff starts for people. And I know that you grew up in Alabama. So what was the first stuff for you? Was it music? Was it comics? Was it both?
It was both. Because of my advanced age, I got my first records and my first comic books in the same year, in 1948. And they were given to me. And in 51 or so, or 52, I started taking a little bit of allowances that I had and buying 45s, and buying comics were much easier, obviously. But as I have mentioned to you once before, the comics were a little bit difficult because it's basically DC, and I'm in that period where Seduction of the Innocent comes out, and many of the comics, I wasn't reading, some of the hardcore stuff, but I was a lot of stuff went away during that period. So I was sort of stuck in the 50s with the DC and the talking animals and the cowboys and all that stuff. But at the same time, I was chasing music and was lucky enough to start going to shows when I was very young, and seeing some great R&B stars and others. And so it was sort of simultaneous. I also spent a shitload of time in the movies, so as much as I could. So it was the big three.
So what were some of the early bands you saw?
Well, very early on, the first show I went to in 1949. I saw Eddie Arnold, who was, one of the biggest selling country stars of all time. And this is in 49. So there's rhythm and blues is really taking off, but as a young thing, I didn't know anything about it. And my life was buried in Alabama and country music. And so I saw that. Then around 57, 58, my mother started letting me go to see the R&B shows, and Ray Charles, James Brown, all the great reviews, Jerry Butler, Chuck Jackson, Major Lance, Otis Redding, you name it. If they were touring and they came through Mobile, I pretty much went. Slim Harpo, the blues artists like that. So,
wow, that's quite a thing to be able to claim that you saw all those guys right at that point. Yeah,
I loved it and really rejoiced in it, but not as much as I should have, because as we know now, as time passes and you realize what you were lucky enough to be part of and to see, and it goes so quickly, and now, it's been a little difficult the last year and a half not being able to see any live music to speak of. So I'm very excited about being able to go back out to clubs and arenas and things like that. I suspect your life was put on hold a little bit. I know you do a lot of recording and podcasts and things, but it's not exactly the same sort of menu if you've got the opportunity to go out and play a lot to crowds and have people in front of you respond to who you are and what you do.
Yeah, I've missed playing. I've missed going to shows, but at the same time, you make lemonade. You do what you can with what's
Sure.
going on. And actually, really, why the podcast started was to still be able to connect with people and talk about our love of music while we were waiting for it to come back onto the stage. What were some of your first comic books?
Well, my first comic books were a combination of cowboys, whether it was crazy things, whether it's the big stars or the B stars, Tim Holt and people like that. Of course, there's always the big stars, the Gene Autry's and the Roy Rogers. But at the same time, my favorite comic book was Captain Marvel, the Fawcett Captain Marvel, as we know, not the DC Captain Marvel, not the Marvel Captain Marvel. So who would have thought that, decades later, I've be at Marvel part of the time when we tried to revitalize Captain Marvel as a character. And let's be honest, Captain Marvel, the Marvel version, has been just about anything and everything you can be, and continues to be. The movie did quite well, as I understand it. So that, and of course, DC is still doing Shazam, and your viewers probably don't know that whole dilemma that Marvel and DC got into when Marvel claimed the rights to the character's name, but couldn't claim the rights to the character. So ergo, DC finally had to put out something, because when they took over the assets of Fawcett and had Captain Marvel as a character, they had to make a deal, and that's how it became Shazam. And it's more complicated than that, but that's sort of the version. That's why we still see Shazam in the movies now.
So was it that there was the name and there was the image that were separate?
Well, the actual character, Billy Batson turning into saying Shazam, Marvel didn't get the rights to that. They just claimed the name because it had gone into, as I understand, it went into public domain, and they were able to claim it. And never had not any immediate attention to do anything with it, as I understand it. But at the same time, this is, I think, mid-'60s, and shortly thereafter, I think DC got the assets to Fawcett and didn't realize they didn't do enough due diligence to find out they didn't have the name. So I guess it's great because we managed to keep the old Captain Marvel alive through the deal that they did with DC. And I'm sure there's some DC people out there that know this story better than I. It's such an interesting sort of quandary and sort of bifurcated character that I think it's always interesting to at least touch on it and let people know why it exists that way.
Tell me a little bit about the transition, because I know that you ended up going into business and went to Rutgers, where I also went.
Yeah, we missed each other by about 12 or 13 years there. Yeah,
I think. And so I was wondering, were you continuing to be like a music fanatic and a comic fanatic, or did that sort of be subsumed by trying to make a living, or what happened?
Well, I will be, being very honest about it, I was far more consumed by the music at that stage versus the comics. I mean, I stayed in touch with comics, but not in depth, because in the early 70s, when I was in graduate school, I read a book called Sound of the City by Charlie Gillette, which was the first really good book on the history of rock and roll. And I thought I knew a lot about rock and roll and its history, and boy, was I a dummy. And so I also discovered thrift shops, flea markets, and started going nuts buying records and collecting records. So anybody who's ever been a record collector, it's hard to be both a giant record collector and a giant comic book collector at the same time, unless you've got endless funds. So I went more in the record direction for many years. It wasn't until the 80s when I started I think when the direct market started and I started seeing comic shops, that grabbed my attention, because I couldn't imagine how that could possibly be, having grown up in the era of newsstands and bad circulation and things like that. So I had to sort of pick up my game a little bit in the 80s. And then obviously the Marvel situation changed the whole equation. So I shifted gears and went back more to comic books than I did to records. Not that I didn't go to see a lot of music. In fact, you and I met because of the Bottom Line, where for people who don't realize it, it was one of the great clubs. It was my favorite club in New York City in the 80s and 90s, and had a great variety of talent. And Jim Salicrup, who was the editor of the Spider-Man magazines, snuck a, as it often happens, you discover when you run a comic book company, things get stuck into books that you're not aware of. He stuck a drawing in of the Bottom Line, and I got to meet Alan Pepper, and you are doing this great, trying to put all these shows together that they did. So comic books and music really intersected there in a very strange way. But at the same time, when I was at Marvel, one of my favorite things, and obviously living in Manhattan, at that time there were tons of clubs. There are not that many clubs anymore. But the cost of real estate and rent has pretty much demolished much of the club scene, except for a few. So, you know, it was comic books all day long and then music at night. So.
Yeah, in fact, Terry's referring to at least one reference that I saw, and I think it was a Fantastic Four, where Ben Grimm comes home and says, honey, I have tickets for the Desert Rose Band at the Bottom Line tonight. You want to go? And Alan Pepper, of course, is very proud of that. And we have multiple copies of that on fridge magnets and et cetera. But yeah, the music comic connection thing has been pretty consistent. And, you know, I'll sometimes go to conventions and meet with creators. And I remember talking to Rich Buckler. You know what? And I remember going to a New York Comic Con and talking to Rich Buckler and saying to him, when you were drawing Deathlock in the 70s, what music were you listening to? And he just immediately said, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Brain Salad Surgery.
Of course.
And I said, really? And he said, yeah, a lot of us were into prog rock. And that was the music that I was listening to when I was reading those mags, because that was my era, was the 70s, when all those characters were being, you know, exploded onto the scene, like Man Thing and Deathlock and Nova, you know, Mega, and this whole kind of explosion of characters that now are considered classic characters. And it seemed to me like the perfect music to read those comics was to read and listen to Genesis or Yes or ELP or King Crimson. And that was what I was doing in my teenage attic in Teaneck, New Jersey in the 70s.
Well, you probably know, anybody who follows the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame knows that we had a very difficult time getting prog rock inducted in any form or fashion. And there was a committee of 60 or 70 that went down to 30 or 40. And I'm not on the committee anymore, the nominating committee, but it's slightly bigger than that now. But prog rock was always something that seemingly a lot of critics did not care for. And I don't have any sound reasons for that, but we could never get any of the real sort of important groups like Genesis and others on the ballot. I always felt once we got them on the ballot, then the voters would take care of the rest. But we finally went to a subcommittee basis, not only for prog rock, but for early rock and roll acts that have been overlooked. And we would elevate these artists, one artist every year, to draw attention to that genre. And that's basically, I think, what led to, I think Genesis was the first one. I don't remember exactly how that played out. But then, you know, getting some more of the groups in there continued to be a struggle. I think we've captured some of them now. There's still others, I think, that will get inducted. But, you know, it's just, it was edgy stuff. And it was very, as you know, when you were younger, but I was in graduate school when a lot of stuff came out, and suddenly it became one of my favorite things. And it's a much broader swath of bands than people sometimes think it is. I mean, when you think about that, and they often morph into something else again as time goes on. So it's the nomenclature people use, but you know, it's broader than that, I think. So
yeah, you run into that problem with people arguing over, is it jazz rock, is it fusion, you know, is it this, is it that, and so many of those areas blurred together. I mean, when you're thinking about the fact that Genesis made it into pop radio and into the 80s, you know, or that groups like Weather Report were able to continue making instrumental music into the 80s. But I want to ask you then about that period where you're sort of hinting at this, which is why prog rock was sort of overtaken and then viewed as something other than the people's music. I don't know, because it was, you know, it was selling shit tons when it came out. those were gold records. Those were records that went, Topographic Oceans sold extremely well, double album, symphonic rock. And then it was kind of replaced by disco and punk. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I mean, relative to my experience with the inductions in the Rock Hall, it was a genre that I don't know why there was sort of a stigma attached to it. I wish I could be clearer on that, but I can't. And I will tell you that the criteria primarily when we talk about nominees were innovative, excellence, and impact. And it was a time when it was very hard to talk about this in the committee about popularity and sales. Anytime you say popular, somebody connotes that as this genre of popular music, which of course changes. I mean, right now, the most popular music in the world, pop music, should be hip hop. That's the way it should work. But other people label soft rock or ballads or something as popular. But, so I used to try to argue, not very successfully, about groups that had sold millions and millions and millions of records and had influenced so many people to get into the business or pick up a guitar and be part of it. But that has now come to prevail a little better in recent years. And I don't know maybe the nominating committee is a little broader now. I'm not sure because I'm not involved with it. But, it was a struggle at the front end. I think people recognize the import of prog rock now, for sure. We had a hard time with hip hop too, because people don't, going back to nomenclature, when Alan Freed coins the phrase rock and roll here in Cleveland in 52, 53, all he did was rename rhythm and blues. And so people want to argue that some of the early rock stars were pop stars. Well, they weren't if you were living then. They were rock stars. And Elvis and Bill Haley were called rhythm and blues stars too, even though they were rock stars. And this thing is very flexible. And so people like to be revisionist when it comes to history and how that works. And it's the nature of it. But music's also something that people take so personal that they form so many opinions. I used to explain to people how mad people would get about people that were inducted or people that weren't inducted. And it didn't matter if they liked everything else that was going on in the museum. If this one act got in or didn't get in, they took that personally. And it's a little bit different than visual arts and other things where you may not care for an artist, a painter, you may not care for a dancer, but you don't get vile about it and say, I'm never coming to that damn museum until they induct Rush or something like, which is what I faced. I'm not complaining, it's just that was the nature of it. You try to explain, I'm sure these artists will get in, and most of them have gotten in over time. So it's a little weird out there, but it speaks to the passion and the excitement about popular music in general. So.
Oh, people are very passionate. I've been playing drums for Todd Rundgren off and on for about the last 10 years. And now that he's been inducted,
woohoo!
Yeah, his fans, we're all very happy about that. But, I wanted to run this by you because I thought his response was very interesting. He was very happy that he knew his fans had wanted this, but he also said that he thinks that halls of fame should be for people who are either retired or dead.
Well, and again, that is certainly a precedent that was set by the sports world. You 5 years after you retire, it's typically for sports halls of fame. But the careers of artists obviously go on for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. The big controversy has always been the Rock Hall's been 25 years after the first record under the name of the inductee. And we weren't always correct in how we inducted people under their name, because very often in the early years in the mid 80s, it could be James Brown and the Famous Flames, and it was only James Brown that got inducted. Now, we were lucky enough to go back and pull a lot of those groups in my last years at the museum. But again, there's also the issue of who's in the band when it gets inducted, because you can have a band that's incredibly significant for the first 5 or 6, 7 years, and they have a huge career over many, many years. But what they produce musically in the latter years, it might often be with one person in the group or 2 people in the group. And then do the other artists who have been, shall we say, sidemen or often just hired help because they're not part of the ownership of the band. And we know those controversies that go on, but so very often they don't get inducted because there's a committee that looks at that and says they weren't there when the band really made its mark or made its position in music. And so it gets back into the whole thing about if they were retired or dead, then it would be a little bit cleaner. So I understand Todd's comment. I'm also saddened by the fact that it took this long to induct one of the real geniuses of the music that we celebrate. And he's been a little bit of everything. And people often don't take into account everything he's done that he didn't record himself. The people he produced, the things he's been involved with, it's immense. And he, as I understand it, he's one of the first, if not the first, to really embrace the digital world. So, he's been a leader for a long time. I'm glad he's in. I know it's probably not to his liking that it took so long. I don't blame him. And it'll be interesting to see if he shows up because I've just seen some vague references that he may not show up at the inductions. I don't know if that's true or not. So
it's only a case that he's on the road touring at that point.
Yeah, no, we and that happens quite often that artists will be committed in the sense that they either can't get out or they choose not to get out because that's not who they are. The show must go on, sort of thing. So that's part of the integrity of certain artists at the same time as being a conflict. So I wish you could be there though. I think a lot of people that are going to attend, and this year they'll be the biggest crowd we've ever had in Cleveland because they moved it from the Public Hall, which is our very old, wonderful music hall. They moved it there to the Rocket Mortgage Arena. So I suspect they'll sell that out and there'll be 19 or 20,000 people there. And I'm sure a large number of those people were hoping to see Todd be there. But, it is what it is.
Well, he's been itching to get out on the road. He's even earlier this year did a kind of tour from a stationary theater in Chicago where they were doing different sets for different cities. So, I mean, he's even been an innovator in terms of how to gig and tour during the pandemic. So yeah, he's had this tour in the works for a long time. And I think he's even playing in Cleveland the week after the ceremonies. So I know, like that, yeah, the routing is what the routing is. And you got to be out there, making it happen to be playing. And I know Todd's only happy, when he's creating and making music and he loves to perform and he's incredible to this moment on stage. So, more power to him.
Well, it's probably even more critical now that the world is opening up again to be fortunate enough to go back out and get booked everywhere. And then the idea that you would step down from that, even if you delayed it and, postponed it or something like that, it's still a very special time right now. Everybody trying to reconnect with audiences and have the venues reconnect with people.
It is. It's that. I think that's the crucial thing, Terry, is that, now not just the audience, the venues, all the restaurants around the venues, the cities themselves, the music brings life to whatever area, you're going into. So yeah, it's a very big issue now more than ever to rebuild a kind of thing, and get tickets for the shows you can get and try to support the artists that you can. I would love to hear about some of your favorite bottom line shows. I mean, the Greenwich Village venue that I'm currently writing a book about, the history of the 30 years of the bottom line, and producing releases. There's over 1,200 shows that are in the archive of recordings. We're finally going to start getting them out again after a pause. So what are some of your memories of the bottom line in New York?
Well, I saw a little bit of everything, but for those who never went there, it was that time when you still had some fairly large names. You had emerging bands, but you had fairly large names that appear in a club that wasn't that big. I mean, when you look at a lot of particularly even the jazz clubs, particularly, some of them are tiny when you get down to the number of tables and seats they have. And it's hard to believe if you were lucky enough to see some of these mega stars in there that they could afford to be there, because you couldn't do it anymore. Nobody would, except on somebody playing some sort of, a salute to people that own the club or where they started. But, I always talk about two shows in particular. I went to the In Their Own Words, which was, I think, the first time anybody really tackled that in the way that Alan and them did, where they brought the songwriters in there to perform and talk about their works. And it was, illuminating beyond anything, and just one of those special nights if you were lucky enough to be there. And I didn't get to enough of them. So those in general, but also they recreated the Phil Spector Christmas album. And they had Darlene Love, and they had Ronnie there. And they also had Sonny Bono, I think, on drums, because he played on the original album. So they played this in order on the album. The other one was they recreated the first Blood, Sweat and Tears album, which is the one Al Cooper leads. And I think John Simon, was the producer, but he had a string quartet that opens it up on the record. And they played that in order. And the great thing was when they finished the 10 or 12 cuts, they went into about 20 bars of spinning wheel, and then stood up without saying a word and just said "not" and walked off the stage. So I thought it was, it always wondered, I enjoyed the later versions of Blood, Sweat and Tears, but I really loved the first version. So, it'd be interesting to know, had they, people talk about horn bands in Chicago, and I always think of Blood, Sweat and Tears before I think of Chicago, even though I love both of them, so.
Yeah, that period of horn bands like Chicago you mentioned. There's a group called Chase.
Yep.
So
well, I told you one of my favorite bands that appeared there a lot is Tower of Power, which is a soul band, but their horn section. I think I'm right about this. I think their horn section, and I forget the guy that passed away not long ago, was the trumpet player, Greg Adams, I think maybe. That horn section played on just a ton of other people's records, because they were so fluid, and Greg was such a great soloist, and they just came with this great background. So that was a band that I saw there, I don't know how many times, and they're still going. That's what's amazing. 50, 54, 55 years later.
I'm hoping we're going to be able to release some of that stuff, because we have a lot of Tower of Power in the recorded archive.
Well, that would be great. And those guys, the two that I know, Emilio and the Doctor, are great guys, great musicians. And, I would love to think that they would find something in there that they like well enough to find acceptable release. They like to get their stuff out there. So,
Yeah, and we have released a bunch of In Their Own Words, which, just for folks that aren't familiar, Terry mentioned how it was 3 to 4 singer-songwriters sitting in chairs, kind of semicircle, and they would tell a story, play a song, maybe take some questions from the host, usually Vince Gelsa, and then after they had gone around and done a couple songs each, they would each play a cover of a song that meant something to them. And so a couple of them released that have been really special that I produced was the only time Pete Seeger and Roger McGuinn performed together.
Oh, wow. Yep.
And then even, right here, the only time that Kris Kristofferson and Lou Reed played together on the Bottom Line stage, In Their Own Words. And that was one that I was particularly pleased with, because to some it would be such an unlikely pair, but Kris and Lou had so many common areas and in their career and their struggles and their way of being honest and open and visceral in their work. So In Their Own Words, which by the way predates things like VH1 Storytellers,
yep,
and, all of these other behind the scenes kind of behind the music things. So yeah, the Alan Pepper's programming was pretty tight there at the beginning, and his vision of repertoire, you could just call it repertoire, and so that when I got to the point where I was performing a repertory group called the Mahavishnu Project, playing the music of John McLaughlin and the Mahavishnu Orchestra, Alan had us in and fit right into what he, was thinking. He had the Mingus Dynasty Band, he had the Basie Band, he had a lot of bands that were playing repertoire, and we would go in and play, complete album.
hear anything there. And I was very saddened because of real estate situations, which has really decimated, as I said earlier, the club situation in New York, when they could not remain in that location. But I was lucky enough to get Alan to let us have the marquee and the awning that was so famous, at least to me and others, for the Rock Hall's archives. And we also have the Stone Pony sign, the first Stone Pony sign. We've got the awning from CBGB's, and I also haven't donated yet, but I have the wooden sign that hung under the Apollo for 30 years. So eventually I was hoping to have this sort of conglomeration of famous mileposts that were, if you were around the New York area, those are some of the places you really went to and heard the best of the best.
You're quite a collector of memorabilia, aren't you?
Yeah, unfortunately, I guess. Unfortunately, yeah. My wife, that would not be the adjective she would use or the adverb. She would go deeper in that and just get rid of all that shit. But yeah, I've posters and signs and records and contracts, photographs, autographs. Some of the stuff that I have a number of the when Bandstand first started in Philly, they would, if you had an artist on, he would go over to the autograph stand, he would sign autographs. And they actually had a pad of paper, WFIL, that said for a fan of WFIL on Bandstand, and that's what they sign on. So I've got Louis Jordan's autograph on there, and I've got Otis Redding's autograph on that, which again tells you the breadth of what Bandstand did, even though that's not what people normally think of when they think of Bandstand. So
Bandstand was big, yeah.
People don't realize they had an act every day of the week, because they were on 5 days a week in the afternoon. They were on Saturday, and at one point Dick even had a show on Sunday. So they would always have artists on there, and not all of them were well known at the time. And there were a lot of acts that passed through there. If you're like with the Rock Hall, where we'd look for footage, and we worked with Dick before he passed and trying to get some of the footage of people that were more obscure, that weren't really artists, that people that released DVDs of Bandstand and things. They weren't really interested in those groups or those artists. So, there's still lots of stuff there that has never seen the light of day.
I'm sure I'd be fascinated to hear a few names there.
Yep.
Any that you can tell us about that you're able to dig up?
No, I off the top of my head, I don't know. But the thing that was interesting to me was that people don't realize that when rock and roll begins, whenever it begins, it really begins with the rise of Black music and Black culture in the United States. We can't delineate it from that. And, in the 40s, when jump blues and then race music and sepia music changed into rhythm and blues, right in that period there in 45 and 46, the vocal groups were as important as the single artist jump blues and R&B artists. So you got all the Black groups, the bird groups, starting with the Ravens in 45 and 46, and of course the Orioles. But then in the 50s, as this music really starts to permeate white society, you have all the white vocal groups from New York and Philly, particularly, that were either had a hit or they were known in the city. And so there are a lot of those groups that were on Bandstand that people never got to see otherwise, and that sort of thing. So I always think of those, particularly during the late 50s. And they lost, I think they had a fire. I can't remember if it's correct. They did lose some of their material. So there are some holes in there somewhere. But it was on 3 hours a day. And I lived in a part of Alabama. We didn't even have a television when it started. And when we finally got a television, they didn't have a station that carried it. And when we finally got a station that carried it, they only carried it 1 hour a day. And the problem is I could see in the paper or the TV guide who people were going to be on there. I want to see these people. Couldn't do it. So.
By the way, everybody, there's a fascinating interview on YouTube, if you can find it, about George Clinton sitting down with one of the guys from Rolling Stone magazine and talking about his history, which goes all the way back to the doo-wop era and the group Parliament.
Yep.
And talking about the importance of the shout music and Louis Jordan and the original R&B guys who were kind of the first rock guys, and George Clinton was there.
No, people, and there's a great point you brought up for people who care about the real history of music, that Parliament was a doo-wop group, first on, I think, Apt, which was a small New York label, and then later on a couple more. But, they went out to be with Berry Gordy. Berry Gordy said, "Go away, we don't want you." And they're from Plainfield, New Jersey, as I remember.
They are.
And George is, even though I think he said he was on the last tour a year or so ago was his retirement tour. I have a suspicion we'll still see him again. I'm not sure.
Well, they're going out again. He said this is the continuation of the retirement tour.
The biggest disappointment I had there was, and he wouldn't talk about it for years, is the mothership that would come down. And we wanted it for the Rock Hall. And he would never tell anybody where it was. And I think there are actually two of them, if I understand this correctly. And finally, I think he gave one. I think one is in the new African American Museum in DC. And I know one was in a like one of those car fields where they put all the junked up cars and everything. That was staying out there. So I always wish we could have had that. But what we did have was, and it was kind of a joke, but we got one of the first diapers from the stage, and as it turns out, it was a Holiday Inn towel. Just so anybody wants to know, it wasn't a real diaper. So.
It would be hard to find one maybe at that size at that time.
Or one that you'd be willing to accept as an artifact,
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, saying it politely.
Terry, I wanted to ask you about Marvel and your involvement there, because those of us who are amazed by what's exploded into this global phenomenon of Marvel, when we were paying 20 cents per issue to get the latest Avengers or the latest Iron Man or the latest Black Panther. But you were there at a time when things were really in transition and even I think during the bankruptcy, but you were there making things happen. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, it's obviously it's a contentious point with some fans because Marvel became a true sort of corporation for the first time. It had always been a business, but it became a sort of a more solidified corporation and eventually went public on the New York Stock Exchange, which then means that your shareholders have expectations about earnings per share. And that means you're going to have a different protocol that's going to be sometimes less driven than the artistic protocol that people prefer. So, Ronald Perlman bought Marvel in the late 80s, and the next highest bidder was Disney. And I think the Disney price, the price that Ronald paid, I think was 82 or 83 million, and then Disney dropped out at 64 million. Of course, then 30 something years later, they buy it for 4 billion. So they always, I heard, and I wasn't part of that negotiation, I always heard that they decided that superheroes didn't really mingle with the mouse and the duck. But if you think about all the things they did in the 90s that didn't sort of weren't congruent with the mouse and the duck, I think probably obviously there was something they missed. They're lucky that they got a second shot at it, even though it's quite more expensive. But basically Ronald bought Marvel because everybody was flabbergasted by the success of Batman, not just the movie but the merchandising, and there was so much money in the merch there. And Ronald saw an opportunity because as big as DC was, Marvel, I think at that time, was still outselling them in number of comics. And so he saw that as a small business that he could get into. He wanted to be in the media world. He bought it from New World Entertainment, which owned it. And they were also a television and theatrical production company. He later on bought all of New World. And if you remember Wonder Years, that was really the biggest success they ever had. Although they did have a very good show called Elvis the Early Years, which was on Sunday nights, which was Elvis when he was still in Memphis. So he bought that, and the idea was to grow the company and somehow merge it into a larger production company, with whatever company that might be. And so, my task was to sell more comics, do more merchandise, and actually one of the other things was get back into the real advertising world, because comics had always been sort of the dustbin for major advertisers, because the quality of the paper, the offset printing, and we had to go get professional. And eventually we got to where we were getting the same amount for a back page of a Marvel comics you would for the back page of Playboy or something like that. So, that was all, I came in there because they still wanted somebody who read comics and had a love of them, as opposed to just somebody who was transactional or operational or driven by advertising, which is what a lot of publishing is. So, and it's obviously, we all know it's a very different world, and one that I understood more so than they did, which was always interesting, because you get not only the business professional, but you get the fanboy. And sometimes what the fanboy thinks might work doesn't align with what people think business-wise you should do. So, and one of them that took me forever to do was the crossover with DC, because it was hard for anybody to imagine that a publicly traded company would share its equity and characters with its biggest rival. And I just had to explain, this is part of the great gestalt of comic books, and everybody will do well financially. And they did, but it was a hell of a task to get it done. So I'm just glad that we were able to pull off that one when we did. So it was a different time. And as I said, Ronald did not, we didn't want to make movies. We wanted to make movies. We didn't think the technology was good enough. So as we expanded and went into theme parks and themed restaurants and trading cards and stickers and all the things that we did, the movies were just something we felt that we would screw up the characters and might ruin the franchise. And particularly since he was looking to eventually move Marvel along, and he thought if the movies were intact in terms of property rights, then it would make it a more attractive situation. The other problem with the movies was that these rights had been sold, licensed, given away, bankrupted, whatever, so many times in the 80s that they were spread out over so many entities that we had to get the rights back, even if we weren't going to make them, because eventually we had to have all the rights back. And it was a very torturous process. And as you know, the story of FF with Roger Corman, we didn't have the rights to that. He had the rights and he had an option, and he made a movie. It cost less than $1 million in order to hold on to the option. So then we had to buy the movie back. So that's a good example of the complications we face there. And then we eventually thought that in the mid 90s there, after a couple of years, that we would try to do something with Jim Cameron for Spider-Man. And he actually wrote a script of his own. And we couldn't, among other things, we weren't getting the rights back the way we wanted to. And then we started running into choppy waters on other fronts. And so that never happened, but that was going to be, the first film that we might make. And shareholders alike, shareholders were looking for this too, not just the fanboys. But Avi Arad did come on board and did executive produce the cartoons, which were quite successful. And most people liked them a lot, and it introduced kids to a lot of the characters. As you know, in the 90s, comics were still imported on the newsstand, but the direct market was where you really got your books if you were a fan. But that newsstand was where a lot of kids first saw these characters. Without cartoons and other forms of media to introduce them, you might never get into that early stage of reading as most of us did. So the cartoons served both a merchandising and an introduction to a younger crowd again, to make them lifelong fans. And then of course we ran into real choppy waters, and just that it was a confluence of comics slowing down, and unfortunately baseball goes on strike, which most people don't realize that was the most damaging blow we had, because we owned 2 trading card companies, and trading cards were returnable, and all this avalanche of cards came back and created a huge financial problem for us. And because of the way Ronald had structured the financing, it created a situation where bankruptcy was the only way to try to solve it. And we could never get it settled with some people that had other controls of the company, and that was it. We all had to walk away. Very, very, very sad, and sincerely very tragic for me, both more intellectually and emotionally, but like everybody else, it was financially devastating to me too. And people don't take that, and that's not a big deal. We all go through these things in life, but it's a very hard thing to recover from. And it's something that I had to, it's part of the reason that I just decided to walk away from reading comics. I couldn't wrap my arms around it. Just it didn't work for me anymore. Unfortunately, I go to the movies, I watch the TV shows, but I have to keep it on some level where I can embrace it and still love it and feel good about it. So,
Well, I do want to talk to you about the recent explosion of movies and TV shows, but I also really would love to hear you talk about working with Stan Lee.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you. Thank you for asking. For anybody who ever met Stan at a Comic-Con or something, and you had a moment or two with him personally, that's who he was 99.9% of the time. I never saw him other than one day when he was not in good health, and this was a long time ago. It was something temporary, where he had sort of a difficult day because he was on 24 hours a day. He was glib, he was funny, and I worked with him in New York when he was there. I went out to LA to work with him. He had left Marvel basically by the time I got there, and he was out in Hollywood trying to make cartoons and movies and things, and that wasn't going anywhere. And we brought him back on board as the creator and sort of marquee that he should be. And so that was great that we were able to sort of reunite with Stan. And then I would take him to a few Comic-Cons, and we had an office in Japan because we were trying to really penetrate the Japanese market. And Stan would go with me to Japan, which it's hard to explain. If you were never around Stan, he was so fucking funny. And he just come up with stuff. And it wasn't the same stuff every time. He wasn't repeating himself. I was fortunate. I had some friends that had never met him, and one of them was actually someone who had seen him speak at Yale in the 70s when Stan was doing his sort of lecture series. And I always wanted to meet him and said, "Do you think you could ever introduce me?" I said, "Well, I haven't seen Stan in a long time. I'll email him and see if we can stop in and tell him we're going to be out in LA." And so I went with 2 or 3 friends and this other guy, and we stopped in, and Stan was there, and he still looks the same to me as he did 30 years ago. This is when he was probably a year, maybe 2 years before he passed. And the first thing he says, "Terry, you got all these people in the room. I'm very hard of hearing." So of course, then I go into my loud voice, and I thank you, Stan, so much for spending time with us here today. And he goes, "Terry, these few minutes I'm spending with you are costing me millions and millions of dollars." And I mean, the whole room just cracked up because that's who he was. He'd come up with this stuff list off just out of nowhere. And so it was a joy. And he would, we would talk about artists, we would talk about stories, but he didn't, at that stage of his life, he didn't really want to criticize artists or writers or anything of that nature. He was just thrilled that the franchise was finally becoming what he thought it could be, and what it almost became several times. I mean, he was more famous, and some of the characters were very famous, but their penetration in the market was not as broad as it became in the 90s. We sold more comics in the 90s than anybody's ever sold. The highest selling comic book we could ever find in numbers was a 1948 Captain Marvel. I think that sold 1,000,008 copies one month. And when we gave Todd McFarlane the Spider-Man book, his sold 2.7 million for that first issue. And then when we gave the 3 guys the X-Men, Jim Lee sold, I think it sold 7 or 8 million copies for that. So I suspect, I think I'm fair on this, those records will never get broken unless something very unusual happens, just because we don't live in that paper world anymore so much. They're still there, but it's just, there's so many other places that they exist. So, but Stan was Stan. I mean, I wish anybody, the first time I met him, I was in LA, and I was sitting there talking to him, trying to tell him my background, and there was a knock on the door, and Bill Bixby walked in. And so, oh boy. And you can imagine, as a fan, I'm like, holy shit. So anyway, everybody loves Stan, and it's just, I'm glad we had him as many years as we did.
And we didn't have his co-creator as long, but Jack Kirby is someone that listeners know that I beloved. I just, have created tributes to him, and someone that I think that is finally getting his due in the world. Recently spoke with Duncan Rollo, the artist and animator creator, about how Jack now has a kind of name recognition, and that even when things were being put out early in the Marvel cinematic universe, you weren't seeing credits created by Jack and Stanley and Jack Kirby. But I know that you were always on Team Kirby at a time, in the 90s, and in my case, in early 2000s, where there wasn't a lot of that.
No, again, like music, people take this very personally, and I understand it. And, there was I got a lot of mail at Marvel, and I tried to respond to all of it. But, it was a lot about Jack and his sort of disappearance within the Marvel world, being forgotten, unlike Stan, who, people that, and I talked to Stan about this some, and Stan, and again, this is from Stan, not from me. Stan said that he really did try to get Jack to come out with him more and be part of the sort of lectures and the things he did, but it wasn't who Jack was. And he tended to be more insular and introspective, or isolated. I don't know what the right words. I never met him. We did do Marvel quietly did create a pension for Jack during the years I was there, and that wasn't done for publicity. We didn't announce it. We did it because we thought it was the right thing. That Stan was now back on the team. Jack wasn't going to come back and join us. We knew that. We knew how important he was, and how important he was to the fans. And there's, just be honest, the both Stan and Jack had specific talents that they were very good at, and people confuse what their functions were. And again, Stan is always the loudest voice in the room, because that's who he was, and he was in every room too. And everybody wanted him in that room because he was entertaining. Not only was he Stan Lee, but he was fun. He was entertaining. So, it was a bit of a dilemma, and as I always kid about, I think while I was at Marvel, we had to clear the building on South Park 3 times for bomb scares, because people threatened to blow up the building. Not about Jack, but about a lot of crazy things, because again, that will tell you how personal this can get,
Really?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Do you remember about what?
I think one time, and it all gets confused in my head now. I think it was one time when we Magneto allegedly died, and I used to tell fans when they would write to me, I said, and this was in the 90s. There's only 2 characters that have ever died and aren't ever coming back, and I was wrong about one of them. One of them was Uncle Ben. I was right about. Spider-Man's uncle. I was right about that, but I was wrong about Bucky. Okay, and so, but I couldn't tell them how or when, because the character would disappear for a long period of time sometimes, and then suddenly make a big deal out when they come back. So I think one of them was around that when it was finally revealed that Magneto was no longer, he was dead in the universe and he was never coming back. Ha 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 ha, that sort of thing. So.
Wow, the fans are pretty intense.
Yeah, but what we didn't talk about, because of the intersection of comics and rock and roll and music, is that one of my good failures, one of my big failures, was trying to do rock and roll comic books, and that was driven not just by my love of it, but the fact that the longer I was at Marvel, I had more and more groups come to me and tell me how much they loved, Marvel. And the lead singer for Cheap Trick is a penciler. He always wanted to be a comic book artist, and we did a promotional book for them. We did one for a hip hop group. We did one for Kid and Play. We did a Kid and Play series, but we tried to do licensed comics, because there was a Revolution comic. I think it was they did a lot of rock and roll stars, but they weren't licensed. And we felt, as you always want to, since we're intellectual property driven for people that are artists that have their own intellectual property, we should license it, which we did. So we had licensed a number of artists, and then I hired an editor to put it together, and we got some art. But we never could really get it out there. We hit these choppy waters on everything else, and we had a number of artists signed up, and the one that we had done that I don't know if anybody cared about, we actually finally got Priscilla to let us do Elvis's story in comic books, and he was a big comic book fan, and he was going to be more of an upscale, not a graphic novel, but a hardbound, a perfect bound book, and it was done in a sort of a metaphysical way of time travel and him seeing himself, and it would be closer to a comic book, I think, in the sense that it would be you would see it, interpret it, and interpret what Elvis was thinking, but never quite got it out. So just one of those things. And again, as you know, there's always been those moments when like the Beatles had comic books and Ricky Nelson had comic books, and they momentarily they were big hits, but they weren't sustainable per se, for a growing period of time. So that was one of my disappointments, and I knew it was a risk, and I said, every so often you just got to try something that you like. So.
Well, I remember from my era the Marvel doing Kiss comics.
Yeah, no, I did the second Kiss. The first one I think was 79 or 80, and that was printed in Kiss blood. Yeah. And as I understand it, Gene went down to the printing plant, and there was a plant we used at that time in Philadelphia, so it was probably in Philly if he actually did it, and pricked his finger and a drop of blood went into the vat, and so you could tell the truth. That was a big hit. Then we did another one in the 90s with him, and I will tell you that as long as it was something that was for Kiss and for him, boy, you couldn't find a better promoter or marketer. As we all know, that's how Kiss has lasted so long and done so well. So it was interesting, and we took him to Comic-Con in San Diego, and he met with all the fans and that sort of stuff. So one of those fun moments.
He's even admitted openly that his look is based partially on Black Bolt from the Inhumans.
Well, he wrote fanzines, as I understand it, in the 60s before he was in a band, I think, or at the same time he was learning guitar or whatever. That's my understanding. So that's his origins are really in that world completely in some ways, as opposed to the music world.
Yeah, and if you've seen his office on some of the reality show that he had, you could see he had Marvel memorabilia all over that place.
Yeah. No, he was a big fan, and it was great to be involved with him momentarily.
Do you remember? I want to ask specifically because of your age and your time coming up, but do you remember Frank Zappa advertising in Marvel Comics in the 60s?
No, I don't. I don't remember that. I know Zappa through the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but I knew him posthumously because he passed and his wife represented the estate. But I knew his love of the material. But unfortunately, I never intersected with him.
I had Don Preston from the Mothers of Invention on the podcast, and I've known Don for a while. I played in his trio a number of times. But that Zappa was a graphic artist.
Yep.
He knew that there was a connection with his audience of comic book readers and of outsider music.
Yeah.
And it was in the Ditko era, Doctor Strange stuff. And those ads are really beautiful. I'll definitely send you some
Yeah, please do. I don't remember ever seeing one. I don't.
Yeah, and it's probably the earliest intersection of music and comic books in physical evidence, I think. So what do you think about what's going on with the Marvel Cinematic Universe now?
I think you try not to let your personal involvement play a role in either direction, either too favorably or too unfavorably. I've been by and large very happy with how Marvel's been in the movies. I think the thing that I love the most is that anytime you can argue about storylines and some things that Hollywood changes because the characters allegedly don't do this or don't do that, but I think the gestalt of Marvel, which is both the seriousness and the humor, that has been able to be conveyed in the movies. I think it's one thing that still sets them apart from DC. You know, the real people with real problems, as Stan used to say at times, that within the realm of superheroes and things who aren't that real, but how do you play that out? And I think a lot of that's been done really, really well in the films. I remember early on when we had some of the stuff where Daredevil was portrayed on TV in completely different colors and all the sort of aberrations that happened around the Hulk thing, which I was glad it was a success, you know, and all that. But at the same time, that wasn't my world. But seeing the movies, I thought, you know, I think Avi Arad, who executive produced the early movies particularly, and still is involved a little bit, who was at the toy company that we owned. Avi was very good about trying to be true to the characters. He had really absorbed a lot of it, as opposed to a lot of folks like him who would, they might take on the task and be driven more by the monetary side. And certainly he was, like we all were. But I think he did a good job of understanding the characters and what they properly do and don't do. You know, it's, and it's so sad, as we both know, when we go to these movies, whoever it is, Marvel or DC or anybody else, and it's not, you sit there and you go, are you kidding me? Are you fucking kidding me? They did that in here. And you know, somebody had a compelling reason they thought they needed to do it. But, you know, I unfortunately am not real thrilled with this latest thing with Black Widow. You know, it's a tough movie to watch for me. I don't know what your feelings are about it.
I found it unwatchable. I didn't stay for the whole thing.
Oh, that's severe. I don't leave movies. I've left 2 movies in my life, and so I sat through them. My wife made me leave a 3rd one, and that was the right thing to do on that one. But yeah, I felt like the sort of allegiance and truth of the Marvel universe had been avoided here a little bit, and have been sort of patched together, and it disturbed me. It had gaps and lapses where things would go from one thing to another, and it didn't make any sense to me. And that's the kind of thing we haven't seen. You may not like the way they portray some stuff sometimes, but they have some of these breaches in character development, or breaches in how it plays out, how logical it's relative to the comic world that we know, because we know there's still rules that have to be obeyed in the comic world, and those get broken sometimes, and sometimes it's okay and sometimes it isn't. But you know, when it happens more than once, or it continues to happen, then you sort of, it loses its credibility. So I thought that was an unfortunate one. And what did I see? One of my friends sent me a note yesterday that their good friend is doing. So it's a woman director that they've hired to do something. I can't remember what it was now. And they're really stretching out into the outer realms of the universe now, trying not to repeat themselves with some of the characters, putting the other characters back to sleep and everything. So it's interesting to see who they're picking.
Well, you know, very much looking forward to another Kirby creation. The Eternals is going to be coming out this year.
Yep. And this is going to be a stretch for people, because again, we're getting farther away from, you know, the known characters, which, of course, when this all started, you know, you'd be hard pressed to say anybody knew who the hell the X-Men were, as popular as they were in comic books. It wasn't a household name for individuals going to see the movies, you know, and it was always that issue: is, are there enough fans out there to drive this? But as we both know, over the last 30 years, and it sort of starts with the Batman movie and just the rise of comics in the 80s with the direct market, the appeal of comic books has become broader and broader, and particularly in the sense that male and female readers are much more a part of this world than they were at one time. Because at one time it was so dominated by men in terms of the audience, you know. And now you go to Comic Cons and you see how it's spread across all the sexes, you know. So I think, you know, it's interesting. It's interesting to see if this next wave of Marvel stuff works, because this last wave, you know, the wave in the last 20 years when did the first one come out? 2003, 2004, something like that?
Actually, around 2000.
Is it 2000? Yeah.
Yeah.
20 years.
I had a very interesting interaction with Stan Lee around that time because I was working on the Requiem for Jack Kirby album, and through Duncan Rouleau, was able to get in touch with Stan for a liner note for the album. And Stan was very happy to do it, but it gave me an opportunity to speak to him as a fan, but also as someone who had just witnessed the opening night of the first X-Men movie. And it was in a sold out giant theater in Paramus, New Jersey. And when we came out of the movie, my wife and I stood there and watched Black people, white people, Hispanic people, Asian people, Indian people coming out of the same movie with their dates. And I said, Stan, that's the greatest tribute you could ever have is you created this thing with Jack, and it reached, through its message of inclusiveness and diversity, reached all of these people, and they put their money down to see this movie. And by the way, a more mixed audience than any concert I had been to.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. They were ahead of their time in trying to integrate comic books in all senses, and it's remarkable when you look at those audience how broad they became. They really did. I mean, we all know it was a little boy thing when it started, and girls read the girl comics and boys read superheroes and cowboys and that sort of thing. But then even when we started in the 90s, I mean, our readership, we're doing tests and we're doing all sorts of research to figure out what's out there. And we tried a number of girl comics before we just had to walk away from it. We couldn't really get any traction. And when we do the research on that, besides there not being an girl audience for it, we realized how many boys made up the market for Marvel. But as the 90s continued, I'd like to think both the explosion of what Marvel did when we went public, what Batman did for DC, and then the comics that we had on television in the 90s. And then we started to introduce more and more female readers and viewers. And I think the movies are so exciting, and I think they did such a great job at the early end. It was able to draw a lot of people in who were probably very skeptical about some of this stuff, or weren't even that familiar with it. Right. But it was well done. It was serious, but had that same that funny aspect to it, that sort of jocular nature that Marvel always had. And so the movies, it's remarkable the universe they built around those artists, and now they've had to rest them. I guess Spider-Man's got one more coming, I think. I'm not sure. Yeah. But right now, I think I don't know of any major plans for most of the big stars that have been out there before. They're branching off into so many of the other areas, which is going to be interesting to see how people. I'd like to think it'd just be a function of how good the movies are. If the movies are quality and they hold up, that's why. Again, I just thought this recent thing. Movie just wasn't. You walked out. I stuck through it, but it wasn't logical enough. Obviously, there's a lot of special effects. It looked good in a lot of places. It had some funny moments, but it just didn't hold up to the quality of everything else that's been done in the universe.
Well, I will say this though, to switch gears, is on the upside, Black Panther to me is a masterwork of comic book filmmaking. Oh yeah, yeah,
and it's remarkable how that movie was accepted and loved, and the legs that it had, and it's one of Stan's great triumphs to have created that in Cage in times when he created them, and things. I mean, it's remarkable that happened, and even the X-Men, when you get underneath X-Men, that's why I can rationalize the hardest one to rationalize is the FF, because they're just wacky compared to, they don't have the same gestalt from me. I love them, but that's why I think the movies have always been, it's hard to be serious and at the same time continue that whole epic story of those characters versus some of the others. So
Yeah, they've all been pretty disastrous.
yeah,
I think when you talk about twisting the mythology a little bit, I don't want to see Doctor Doom on the ship with them during the origin story. Just don't do that to me, man.
picky.
It's funny because around that time I had this realization. If they were making the movies for the geeky fans like me, who's got to be like what? At that time, 20 years ago or whatever, 5%, less than 1%, less than 5% of the audience. So they're not making it for me. So of course I'm going to be tweaked by that sort of stuff. And then I then I came into a new frame of mind, which is I want to see what it would look like to see the Silver Surfer fly. I want to see what it would look like to see the acrobatics of the urban Daredevil world. And then if you're going to fuck with the story, I have to care less, but I want to see what it would look like for Daredevil to have his Billy Club and to be moving around, and so I made that deal with myself.
Well, I really enjoyed the very dark Daredevil. It was the last series. Was it on Netflix? I guess is where it was. And very gritty and violent. I really enjoyed it, and the movies had been disastrous. At least the Daredevil movies had been. What was it? The one then followed up by Elektra? Is that what it was? Yeah. And I always thought Daredevil. I love Daredevil right behind Spider-Man. It's my second favorite character because he has powers, but they're limited, and it had more of a sort of a human interest element, some more down to earth, and I like the juxtaposition of that with the true superhero stuff that we saw the rest of the time. So I enjoyed the Daredevil series. I enjoyed Cage, and I thought that was good. I struggled with Iron Fist. I mean, it was campy, and I know that. So I was trying to figure out, am I jousting against windmills here, because that's not fair. So, but I haven't.
Jessica Jones.
The same. At times I liked it, and other times I didn't like it. I was mixed on that. How did you like it?
Well, for me, anything with David Tennant, I'm there front row.
Okay.
And just an incredible, powerful villain.
Yeah.
And, he really brought it, and I found him disturbing. And I'm a big Doctor Who fan, so he's my favorite Doctor. But David Tennant for me was worth the price of admission on Jessica.
Okay. Yeah. We moved recently, and in this whole process of moving, life changed a little bit. I haven't been able to subscribe and see WandaVision and some of the new
I
stuff.
recommend it.
Yeah, my friends tell me, because when you look at it on the surface, it looks wacky. Not that Marvel isn't wacky in places, but everybody told me it was really good.
Quite good.
Yeah, so I'm looking
and
forward.
The new Loki is quite good.
Yeah, I haven't seen it either. Yeah. That's what I hear. So I mean, it's remarkable the legs that these characters have gotten and have become accepted, shall we say, within the broader universe. To your point, how few people back in the 90s were really involved in this really wonderful little world that we all love. But it has branched out and become acceptable to, again, just the whole male-female thing was a stretch back years ago. Would have never happened. And now, as I said, at Comic-Con, you see as many women in costumes as you see men. So, and it's wacky, but I love it. It's great.
How did you like Falcon Winter Soldier?
I liked it. I thought they were running out of gas about that stage. I didn't, it wasn't my favorite. And I look forward to what comes behind this. There's still there's repercussions. It's going to if they continue in that direction, or how they continue in that direction. I think as I said, I'm really interested to see how successful they are as they branch out into the broader, shallower part of the universe relative to books and that. But again, if they can create that same gestalt around the characters and be true to them, I still have a lot of trouble. And DC was my comic book, because when I grew up, I'm so old, that Marvel didn't really exist when I started. I had to get that in high school, and it was a period when I wasn't reading as much. But I've been so disappointed by the DC films, and I think a lot of people have been. I mean, they aren't financial disasters, but they aren't huge successes either. And Suicide Squad, which I want to love, but I didn't. And I look at them trying to create that humor that Marvel has, and for some reason it hasn't translated. It just doesn't seem to occur.
Really looking forward to Shang-Chi, Master of Kung Fu.
Yeah, I just finally saw a preview in the theater the other night for that. What is that, October, I think? Well, that's a good bellwether for how these are going to do. We'll see how, on sort of that standalone basis, does this work or not, So since it's so unconnected to everything else for the most part,
Well, I know that you're still connected to the music world, Terry. So tell me a little bit about what's going on in that area of your life.
Well, after I retired from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, as I often tell people, my wife said she married me for better or worse, but not for lunch. Go get a job. And that caused me to look around, and the jobs I wanted weren't here in Cleveland. So I wound up going to Nashville to work for Gibson Guitar, and was in charge of artist relations there for a year. And then Gibson ran into financial problems. I left there. And I had some friends that had been benefactors of the Rock Hall that wanted me to come to Arkansas and help build an entertainment center. So, it's been the last 6 or 7 years was spent commuting to Arkansas, building 2 or 3 venues in one location, booking everything from Brad Paisley to Migos. And my musical tastes are that broad. It's everything from doo-wop to hip hop. And I embrace all of it. On any given night, I might like something better than another, but I've been around this thing called rock and roll, which is just another term for rhythm and blues. That when it first started, that there's always redeeming factors in all these artists, and I just always trying to find my next drug. So and it's a great joy. It really is. So that's what I've been doing, in the last 6 or 7 years, is sort of pursuing the living in the not-for-profit world. Right now, I'm working on a very interesting jazz exhibit by one of the leading jazz artists in the world, Terry Lynn Carrington. She's one of the more famous drummers, and she has got an exhibit that she's been working on for years. The working title is Jazz Without Patriarchy, because like a lot of things in our society, women were excluded in the field of jazz. They were mainly singers or vocalists, with a few exceptions. And we're going to highlight one of them, Mary Lou Williams, who was a great keyboard player, and Jerry Allen, who was another one who passed away just a couple of years ago. But I think of Lil Hardin, who was Louis Armstrong's wife, who not only played in his band, but she also helped him dress and do a lot of other things. So we're going to cover some of that, but it's really looking back at the history of jazz with the women being excluded or pushed to the side, and how they've now come to the forefront over the last few years. So, and I'm working on a jazz museum in Oakland, California. We'll see if it happens. We're still doing some of the legwork there. And as you know, the San Francisco area is a huge jazz area, and they have San Francisco Jazz, which is probably one of the leading arenas of its kind in America. And so across the bay there in Oakland, we're trying to do something just to tell the story of jazz and its relationship to modern music. Jazz and even hip hop now have gotten a much stronger relationship than they had years ago. It used to be, it was hard to even put those two together, but you'll actually see some of the rappers today talking about their love of jazz and how they've incorporated some aspects. And they're very, they're always eager to glam onto something that they can sort of meld into who they are and what they do, and make it relative to another art form or another era or something like that. So, I'm blessed to still be doing some stuff. It's fun.
Yeah. those connections are between hip hop and jazz are strong. I mean, if you look at Flying Lotus and Herbie Hancock and Thundercat and Kamasi Washington and Kendrick Lamar,
Yep.
there's an embracing of hip hop and rap as being a kind of continuance of jazz, and I think that that's very healthy.
Yeah, philosophically, I think people might have an easier time to think about the whole breadth of jazz and its improvisation and what hip hop does in that world, and how those people create much like a jazz artist would create, even when they're not, even if it's just lyrically, before you add the sort of the musical element to it. Yeah. And hip hop is the strongest genre of music in the world. It's just, and that aggravates people, but it's the nature of the beast. And you think about, this really takes off, and you'll appreciate this. I don't know if I told you this. I had the brilliant idea. I loved hip hop, and still do. And in 1991 or 92, I decided I'd do the first ever hip hop dictionary.
Ah.
And as an offshoot of Marvel. And don't remember if we were going to put it under the Epic label or how we were going to brand it. But it was going to be a perfect bound book. And we put together a dictionary. And again, you got to remember, this is hip hop really takes off in 79, but this is 12, 13 years later. So the vocabulary is big, but it's not as big as it is now. But, and I got, I think it was Nelson George that I got to write, the very, very, very elite writer to write the preface and the introduction. And then I couldn't get anybody to take it. I mean, we knew it wouldn't sell in the direct market, the comic market. This isn't something we knew it would sell a little bit, but I needed to get it in bookstores. And damn it, it never got published. I mean, we even had the idea that we realized we'd have to have a glossary that got added every year, the annual sort of appendix it would be, because the language continued to move forward and change. So that was between that and the comic books about rock and roll. Those are the two things that really didn't quite work for me at Marvel. But what the hell?
It's like you're thinking ahead of the curve always, Terry. Seems to me.
Well, I think what I was thinking is about what I really liked, and you got to be careful there, because obviously what you like is not what other people will like. The thing that got me into some trouble with some Marvel fans was that sometimes the story arcs were so long that it was really hard. It was hard for some people to get into the arcs. So it doesn't mean that you had to kill off anybody, but it meant somewhere you sort of needed to wind it down to a point where you could sort of promote and publish the fact that, the new X-Men or something, and whatever the storyline. And we got around that, both changing the storyline, plus we created so many different, we went from like 50 or 60 titles a month up to like 110 a month. And that was either dividing the characters in multiple books or coming up with new books and new categories and things like that. So, it was, again, when you're a public company and you're doing earnings per share, you can do a lot of things that, maybe later on, maybe I shouldn't have gone quite that far, but that's what we did.
Terry, it's been a blast speaking with you about all these different worlds that connect in our brains. And
the right brains are correctly right brains.
the
right and left brain.
Right. And I hope you'll come back and speak with us again. It's really been a blast, and I appreciate it.
You're kind to have me. I appreciate it. It was a good time. And I hope I see you out playing somewhere, doing some music at some point, now that we've become known to each other. So, be well. And there's only one way to close this, since he's not here, is Excelsior. So
Excelsior.
Okay. Ciao.
Thanks everybody for listening, everybody. And ProgCast is going to keep going. We're going to keep exploring. I thank my guest, Terry Stewart, very much for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.